Welcome back. Well, a massive rescue effort is continuing after a religious ceremony descended into chaos just hours ago, with at least 44 people crushed to death and more than 150 others injured, some in a critical condition. Well, the incident, which has been called Israel's worst peacetime disaster, happening as over 100,000 Jewish worshippers descended on Mount Meron to take part in the OMER holiday, which is where people gather at the tomb of the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai before people slipped from the stands, creating a devastating domino effect, falling onto others below. Well, as I mentioned, a huge emergency response is underway, although there are reports that rescue efforts are being hampered, with some of the remaining worshippers refusing to leave the site, clashing with police and rescue teams.
We just finished treating one of Israel's worst disasters, a terrible disaster of people who came to celebrate Lag BaOmer at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and unfortunately were literally crushed to death. Many people were hurt, injured, and killed here, and the volunteers behind us here right now are being gathered together for an immediate debrief on the psychotrauma unit due to the fact that they were exposed to very difficult sites that we haven't seen here in Israel since the worst days of terrorist waves back at the beginning of the 2000s.
And let's go back to our senior correspondent, Owen Alterman. Owen, tell me, what are we hearing from Israel's Prime Minister in response to this incident?
Obviously, Netanyahu, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, sent his condolences, as one would expect. There is a lot of anger, we should say, Sarah, not necessarily at him, but at other elements of the Israeli authorities. Real calls in Israeli media to investigate the Israeli police and ask how an event like this could have happened, how the approvals could have been given, how the policing was done. Not only necessarily in the specific issue of this particular ramp, but the wider event. Calls that the site is not able simply to take in the hundreds of thousands of people who get there, and that the authorities simply aren't organized enough in order to manage an event of this magnitude. Obviously, this is a huge event by the standards of a country of Israel's size. Again, I tell you, I've been there 3 times. It is very crowded. I never imagined that something like this would happen, although I understand that it had been imagined by others who are responsible for events like this and think ahead. We can also say that there is a political element to this. The Toldos Aharon Hasidic sect, which was where this incident happened, it was its lighting of its bonfire, of course, the traditional bonfires of Lag BaOmer, many of them lit on Mount Meron by Shimon Bar Yochai's tomb. That this is one of the most extremist sects within the ultra-Orthodox sector in Israel. And even if the police had understood what needed to be done, and even if the police were prepared to take the necessary steps, there's still a question of whether that group would have listened. And it's not clear whether all of the people who were tragically killed or hurt in this incident were from that sect. Again, there are many people who go to their events. I don't know that I've been to their event in Mount Meron, but I've been to a number of their events in Jerusalem, who certainly aren't from the sect itself, but go to their events because they're large scale and they can be very inspiring. But it's not clear whether this group would even be willing to listen to the police. So in addition to the logistical issues that need to be investigated and the other issues that need to be investigated, there's the underlying political level that, again, would still remain.
No, and tell me, what are we hearing from the leaders there of these ultra-Orthodox communities?
Obviously, one would imagine people are in shock. Again, there is the pressing issue of notifying the families. There's also the pressing issue, Sarah, of burying the dead. As you may know, in the Jewish tradition, the dead are buried quickly. And also the dead cannot be buried on the Jewish Sabbath, which is coming tonight. And so the funerals need to happen over the course of today. The bodies need to be found and identified and need to be brought to their burial sites. And then the funerals need to take place before sundown. So there's a huge logistical challenge. And of course, that's before you get to the emotional challenge, the psychological challenge of families. One would imagine large families, as you mentioned, potentially people who are very young or even children who are among those who have lost their lives. And so there's a huge task ahead for this group and for other groups, obviously, as the entire country just starts to digest what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Shocking situation. Owen, I'll come back to you a little later on. Let's now go to our Middle East correspondent, Emily Rose, who joins me on the phone. Emily is on the way there to the scene. Emily, good morning. What is the very latest that you're hearing?
It looks as though at least 44 people have been confirmed dead in this tragic evening, and could be scores more wounded. The MDA, the MADA, Magen David Adom, that's the Israeli version of the Red Cross, has been treating wounded and critical injuries throughout the night. The images now circulating across the media are just shocking. The stampede itself, the crowd, trying to put pieces together of what really did happen in those moments when the crowd came together, and already starting to see reactions from political leaders coming out, talking about how tragic this event is, perhaps the worst in peacetime Israeli history. Perhaps even just now, at least when we're looking at the death toll, equaling the death toll of the Carmel fires a few years back. And it could be more, it could rise, as it looks as though medical professionals are treating very serious wounds, and certainly political leaders now coming out to as well express their condolences to the family and discuss the tragedy of last night's events.
And Emily, we are hearing that these rescue efforts are actually being hampered due to people refusing to leave the area and clashing with authorities there.
I did see reports circulating as such. There were also reports that different medical teams were saying that they were also, they just never seen anything like this kind of tragedy. So, yes, it could be that in the mire of these medical teams, they are hampered to try to do their work as well. All that, of course, as we heard our correspondent Owen mention, the Sabbath enters this evening. So it could be that because these are ultra-Orthodox worshippers, they will have to clear at least for the Sabbath, because that also is prohibited. So we'll have to wait and see.
And Emily, I'm hearing that there are still a lot of people unaccounted for, with the emergency responders setting up hotlines for people to try and get in touch with their loved ones.
Yes, we'll have more information for you on that with an official announcement from the Magen David Adom. But one of the challenges, as was also mentioned by our correspondent, will be notifying the families, and they will have to also go through and be able to identify all of these people within that time frame. So likely hotlines like that, emergency hotlines. We could also see intervention here and help from the Home Front Command, which could also sometimes does set up a hotline in events like these. Likely we'll see their involvement here as well, to try also as well to notify the families.
All right. Emily Rose there, thank you for the update. I'll go back now to Owen Alterman, who's there from Petah Tikva. Owen, this, of course, coming as a lot of political negotiations are happening. They've really been sort of dominating the headlines here in Israel over the last couple of weeks. How does this shift the focus of everything now?
Well, nobody's talking about any of that this morning, Sarah. That's completely out of the picture. Everyone is focused on this event. Everyone is focused on the breaking news of this event. As Emily mentioned, finding those who have not been accounted for. And there it's important to emphasize, there's no cellular service on the top of the mountain during this event. There's simply too many people. I know from the 3 years I was there simply is no cell service. It simply can't handle the hundreds of thousands of people who are there, certainly not the Israeli networks. And I know that once when I went with a friend, we got separated again because of the crowds. We simply couldn't find each other because we didn't have cell service. So that makes it even harder. There may have been people who were nowhere near this event, who were certainly not in any danger, but the families still can't find them or identify them because they have no way to reach them. An issue that we can presume will be remedied over the next few hours as people start to disperse. But it certainly doesn't help us in the here and now, as people are obviously very, very concerned about their loved ones. But as the political negotiations, that's certainly nothing that anyone is talking about right now. It's hard to say how this event affects those. It's also the case that, yes, while it's true that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu now has 4 days until the expiration of his mandate, the reality is that the real deadline for these negotiations to take place is maybe 4.5 weeks from now, maybe 7.5 weeks from now. So that the real deadline, not the fake deadline, if you will, but the real deadline is off into the future. And this event will not necessarily, I don't think, affect those negotiations. But we can certainly, I think, see the Israeli parliament entering into the picture. We had a call by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the member of the Religious Zionism Party, one of its most extreme members, if you will, come out and say that he is a member of parliament. By the way, he was 30 or 40 yards away from this event when it happened. As it stands, he certainly wants a parliamentary investigation, and I'm sure will not be the only one.
Okay, Owen Alterman there, thank you very much. Let's now bring in Yankee Farber, who is a journalist and resident of Bnei Brak. Yankee, thanks for joining me this morning. Terrible morning for your community. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, well, let's say I didn't sleep from last night because usually on this event, we stay awake till about, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., we celebrate, and then we go to sleep. But just before we went to sleep, the whole disaster started in Miron, and I've been running all over, and I want to tell you that this is something that we've never, ever, we don't have such an experience in the Orthodox community. I mean, everybody's upset, not just Orthodox people who are at the place, but many of them, and probably a lot of the people are dead or young, very young, like age 15, 16, 17. And I want to say that I believe some of them might not even be Israelis. Some of them might be American. Some of them might be European. These people came to Israel to yeshiva, to study here, and they came to Miron. So it might even take longer to reach their parents. Now, we must remember that these young people don't have a cell phone on them, and maybe they don't even have an identification. So it's like very, very hard to get all of them. I believe of the parents. I believe it's going to take another few hours to get hold of everyone. Yeah, everybody's very, very upset, and there will definitely be an investigation, but something very strong. Not just 3-4 people sitting down and discussing it. I believe the police will they need to give some answers how such a thing happened. I mean, there are different people say that the police fault, and people say that the people fault. I think we need to blame somebody. We need to give time for the.
And Yankee, we have about a minute.
It's a very, very hard morning.
Certainly, we've got about a minute with you left. Yankee, tell me what happens in the coming hours. What's the procedure here?
Well, basically, they will try to identify the people and bury them. Make a funeral before Shabbat. I don't think they would be able, because it's so easy to identify all of them. But they're planning to bring them to bury them as possible, because this is for the halacha, for the Jewish way, to be straight away. I believe only Sunday or maybe Saturday night, I think funerals coming out from all over.
Yeah, well, it's an absolutely devastating incident, and condolences to your community there, Yankee. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
And just to recap, at least 44 people are dead after a shocking incident in Israel's north overnight, where people began falling on top of one another and then trying to race out of an area where they're running over the top of each other. And we are seeing images, live images, coming now from Israel's north with this massive rescue effort underway as victims are trying to be identified and authorities are looking for missing children. We will, of course, keep you across this story throughout the day. We'll be back a little later. Stay with us.